dignity is in jeopardy. National borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. Wherever men or women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe. I share this quote because many of us may be asking the question, well, am I a racist? I didn't say anything, I don't do anything. At this point in time, that's not enough. Our silence must be broken. As public health professionals, we must use our voices, our positions, and our skills to help mend our broken world. In just a moment, I'm going to hand over this session to our moderator and to our outstanding panelists. Our moderator today is Dr. Jaime Slaughter-Acey, who I'm so pleased to have on our faculty. Dr. Slaughter-Acey brings an abundance of expertise in her work on colorism and racism, and has just been honored by the National Institutes of Health for her work. And I just feel so fortunate to be able to work with her. So before I hand this over to Dr. Slaughter-Acey, I ask for a moment of reflection. If you are able, I ask you to stand. If you prefer, you may take a knee. And if you feel comfortable, I invite you to close your eyes and envision two people from our community on either side of you supporting you. I ask that you reflect upon and honor the memory of George Floyd. I ask you to reflect on all those who have been traumatized by recent events, and indeed events over the past 400 years. I ask you to reflect upon the loss and destruction that has happened to our beautiful and diverse Lake Street and the surrounding areas. I ask you to reflect upon all those whose voices have gone unheard, and I ask that today we all commit to ensuring that those voices are heard. Finally, I ask that you reflect and honor all of those, many of those who are in this space today, who are working tirelessly toward the prevention of the spread of both racism and COVID-19, and who are working day in and day out to improve the lives of all people, particularly those at highest risk. I ask you today to commit yourself to doing more. So let's take a moment of reflection, and then whenever you are ready, Jaime, please take it away.
All right, thank you, everybody. So again, I just want to welcome everybody for coming today to this very important EpiCH webinar and discussion regarding the death of George Floyd, the policing of Black Americans, which is rooted in structural racism and our role as public health change agents. And while I wish that we were in our WBOB, our West Bank building, in person, in community, for this discussion, I know that we will see the roots of a very rich, informative, and action-based discussion today. So with that, I want to just sort of set some ground rules for today's discussion. First, just some technical ground rules. Please make sure that your mic is muted if you're not speaking. And if you have questions, to submit them via the chat to specifically to Jennifer Lynn.
Okay, so it looks like we're dealing with one of the technical issues involved in doing Zoom, and we have lost Jaime for a moment. So let's just wait a couple of moments and see what happens. She'll probably come back on.
Yeah, hi everybody. This is Jennifer Lindy. Just wanted to reiterate, I'll be moderating questions and handing them off to our panelists after that portion of our meeting. So please use the chat function to send those questions to me directly. You can select who you want to send your question to. So look for my name and I will collate those and pass them on to our panelists. Thank you while we're waiting.
You want to comment on the readings, Jennifer, while we're waiting?
Oh yeah, sure. Thanks, Mark. We had a couple of questions in advance, and I would say that about half of those said, I'm looking for, where I can learn more, I'm looking for resources. And so what I'm going to do this afternoon is send out a list of readings and resources for people. So you can look for that later this afternoon. So that was a great question. And we had a wonderful suggestion that sometimes shutting off video does help with bandwidth. So, it's not great at facilitating conversation, unfortunately, and connection, but if you're not speaking, you may want to just go ahead and turn off your video for now. And then if you have a question later or you're part of the conversation that is going on in the moment, please, if you would like, turn your video back on. As sort of a behind the scenes moderator for this, I'm going to go ahead and shut my own video off for now as well, while we wait for things to sort out. So thank you for your patience.
So actually, Rhonda, I'm going to suggest that perhaps you want to get things started. Okay.
Okay, sure. Okay. Well, I'm going to be sharing a group of slides, and so great. Thanks, Sonya. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for the opportunity for Sonya and I to share our research on preventing violent encounters between police and young Black men. Our goal really is to highlight key findings that are really most relevant for today's discussion. And we hope our results will encourage reflection, dialogue, and resolve for change. Next. The issue of violent encounters between police and young Black men has a very long history in the US. Over 100 years ago, W.E.B. Du Bois and the Souls of Black Folk said, excuse me, daily the Negro is coming more and more to look upon law and justice, not as protecting safeguards, but as sources of humiliation and oppression. The laws are made by men who have little interest in him. They are executed by men who have absolutely no motive for treating Black people with courtesy or consideration. And finally, the accused lawbreaker is tried, not by his peers, but too often by men who would rather punish 10 innocent Negroes than let one guilty one escape. Next. Okay. Inequities in the experiences of Black men with police are increasingly being acknowledged by broader society. And this is largely due to our 24-hour news cycle and the fact that we can record things in real time, as we saw with the death of George Floyd. While the issue of violent encounters between police and young Black men is receiving national attention, there's been limited attention, particularly in public health literature. And so one of the impetus for our research is really to address this gap and also to encourage public health to be in the forefront on this issue. Violence between police and young Black men is a public health issue. Next. We know, for example, that Black men are disproportionately killed by police. Black men between the ages of 18 and 44 are 3 times as likely as white men of the same age group to be killed by a police officer. While Black men make up roughly 6% of the US population, they account for 1/3 of unarmed individuals killed by police. Next. So our research really is trying to lay the groundwork to prevent such encounters, and to do so through a health equity lens and a public health perspective. So our first pilot project really focused on the causes of violence and existing prevention resources. Our key questions were, what causes violence between police and young Black men? Are there existing policies, programs, and practices that can prevent such a violence between police and youth? And third, what existing infrastructures can be leveraged to strengthen police-youth violence prevention efforts? We had the privilege of being able to interview 48 key stakeholders who either lived or worked on the east side of St. Paul or the north side of Minneapolis. Our key stakeholders included young Black men, police, and adults working in youth serving organizations. Next, please. Our second pilot project, which Sonya will describe, really focus on really moving towards action via community mobilization. And that means working with existing efforts to around community mobilization. And so our key question here is, what can be done to prevent violence between police and young Black men in particular? We are planning to conduct virtual interviews with 30 or 40 stakeholders in Minneapolis. These will include young Black men, police officers, and then community members focused on violence prevention. Next, please. Before sharing our results, I want to acknowledge our funders. Our study is funded by the Center for Healthy African American Men through partnerships. This is a collaboration between the University of Minnesota Medical School and the University of Alabama Birmingham Medical School. And the center is funded by the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities. I also want to acknowledge the really great work of our research assistants for whom these projects would not be possible. Colin Calvert, who is one of our PhD students in Epi, Lauren Gaines, who is a former CHP student, Gabriel Horsford, who is a current community health promotion student, Jaime Slaughter-Acey, who is a PhD student in health policy management, and then Christopher Robertson, who is a PhD student in sociology. Next, please. I'm going to just highlight some of the key findings, again, that are really most relevant to our discussion. You can find a more detailed description of our methods and other key findings in these 2 publications. One just recently was published in 2020 and the other is 2017 to 2018. Next, please. So we asked our participants about violence prevention in general, but specifically about violent encounters between police and young Black men. And we wanted to know their perceptions about the causes of these types of interactions. And 6 themes emerged from our key informant interviews with the various stakeholder groups that I just described. One, and you'll notice that many of these themes that they sound very familiar. They have been echoed, particularly in the recent incident with the death of George Floyd. One, police lack a connection with the Black community. Second, over-policing of Black communities and racism in the police force. Another cause, community members fear and distrust police. Fourth, police fear and distrust community members. Youth disobey laws, talk back to police, and resist arrests. And 6th, socioeconomic conditions that may place Black young men in greater contact with police. I want to mention that the theme around youth disobeying laws, that many of the participants felt that this arose really out of fear of police. So I want to now share some quotes related to some of these themes to get a better feel for the kind of thoughts and perceptions of our participants. Next, please. In terms of the theme, police lack a connection with the Black community. This is a quote from one of our youth. It says, when you do have that one cop who's in the community, then you see a real strong bond. But then a lot of these cops are just out here doing their jobs from another city, just coming into the inner city, and they don't really relate or connect to kids. Next, please. The theme, over-policing of Black communities. This is a quote from a police officer. I think more than anything, it's a trust issue. They grow up in a community where disproportionately they or their family members have been singled out and enforced at a higher level. And it increases the distrust and dislike of the system. Again, this was a quote from a police officer. Next, please. Racism in the police force. This is a quote from one of our staff working at youth serving community organization. They don't come in with the gratitude of a servant. They don't come in with the mindset of, I'm going to serve you. How can I help you? They come in with a mindset of, I'm big and bad now, and you know it. If you ever challenge that in any type of way, not only do I have to prove it to you that I'm big and bad, because now my insecurities are hurt and now my pride is pinched, but I have to prove to everybody else around that just saw that I'm big and bad, because now they're not going to be scared of me. And that was a quote from one of our staff at a youth serving organization. Next, please. Our third theme, community members fear and distress police. This is a comment from one of our police officers. What sucks is we'll build these relationships with these kids, but their parents and their friends and their relatives may have had a bad experience in the past with police. So I've seen people tell their kids not to talk to the police. I've seen people tell their kids that we're murderers. I've seen kids tell me that, oh, my mom said that they're just going to shoot me, so I should not talk to you. When that comes out of a kid's mouth, I mean, it makes me feel like crap. It's like, I'm not going to shoot you. I do not go around every day wanting to shoot people. I just want to talk to you. Next, please. Police fear and distrust community members. This was a quote from one of our youth. They're probably scared of us. So them being scared causes them to act out like that, causes them to do stuff they should not do as officers of the law. I mean, they kill people. They be so nervous, and having that gun on their side makes them feel like they got a little more power than the next person. And I know that gun can change somebody's life, let alone take somebody's life. Next, please. We also, most importantly, wanted to get a sense of what resources really were out there to specifically address police violence with young Black men. And the findings were really quite concerning. So when we asked participants what specific policies or programs or practices there were to specifically address violent encounters with police and young Black men, most participants, for the most part, really couldn't identify specific policies or programs. They typically pointed to youth prevention policies in general, such as curfew laws around youth. They mentioned local programs, but none could specifically focus on identify specific policies. A few mentioned body cams, but this was actually related to another question we had asked them. I think it's important to note our study took place in 2017, and since our data collection, many of you may be aware the state developed a task force to address some of these issues. So Attorney General Keith Ellison and John Harrington, the Commissioner of Public Safety, were key conveners of that task force. What we did find out was that participants really could mention these informal practices to reduce the likelihood of these types of encounters. It's what we refer to, particularly in the Black community, as the talk. The talk one has with kids, Black kids, whether it's your son, whether it's a neighbor's kid, a family member, around how to behave around police. And these types of practices really place the onus of prevention on young Black men. Many of you probably are aware, for example, telling your son, keep your hands on the steering wheel when a police approaches your car. Don't reach for the glove compartment. Again, these kinds of informal practices. I think it's important to note that our participants indicated that, as you might expect, these types of informal practices just aren't effective. And I think the death of George Floyd is an excellent example of this. When the police approached him, he did put his hand on the steering wheel. The next slide is a quote from one of our youth related to this very point around our reliance on these informal practices to negotiate encounters with police. This is a quote from one of our youth. It says, just being respectful and talking to him like you would talk to an elder, and just having the most I was always taught to just have the best communication to a police officer and the most respect, because that's the ones who we fear the most. And now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Sonya, who's going to talk about our second pilot study.
Thank you, Rhonda. So Rhonda mentioned earlier that our project is funded by the Center for Healthy African American Men through partnerships. Many of you are familiar with grant cycles, the lives of grants, and we actually went into what's called a no-cost extension, and there were existing funds to continue our work. And we wanted to think very intentionally about what to do next. And we knew that what we wanted to do is to move towards action. And I had an existing relationship with the director of the Office of Violence Prevention at the Minneapolis Health Department. Sasha Cotton had come and spoken for several years to a class that I teach, Adolescent Health. And we spoke with her about the work we were doing and whether she was interested in a partnership that would lead to some type of community mobilization efforts that their office could play a key role in to try and prevent violence between police and young Black men. I mentioned that we wanted to be intentional about this. Many of you who engage in community-engaged research can understand and appreciate the importance of sustainability, that when we work with communities, we want to make sure that whatever we're doing can be sustained over time, or else it contributes to this perception and reality of a university coming in, wanting to do good, but funding ends, or there's a lull in funding, and then the work stops. So we wanted to try and avoid that with this effort. One of the benefits of this partnership is that we have had the privilege of interacting with community navigators who have a position within the Minneapolis Police Department, and their role is to help the police department interact with communities in Minneapolis who have been historically oppressed and mistreated by the police department. And so their role is really to help police interact with communities in proactive ways, to be present at events when there are high levels of tension, and to try and be of assistance. And so we've been planning this project with them. Given the limited time that we have, what we want to do is to gather additional information that will help in terms of action. So our plan has been to conduct semi-structured interviews that will be held virtually. We have 3 stakeholder groups of young Black men, police officers, and then a community subcommittee that's part of a violence prevention steering committee that the Office of Violence Prevention holds. Okay, what I wanted to do is to share with you the questions that we've developed with our community partners. And our questions are very similar across all of our 3 key stakeholder groups, but I wanted to share the specific questions that we'll be asking of young Black men. We thought it was very important to begin our conversation by talking about the assets and contributions of young Black men. What are some of the ways that young Black men are making a difference in their communities, schools, churches, mosques, and families in Minneapolis? We also wanted to acknowledge challenges to well-being and future success and see what others perceived those challenges to be. Young Black men can face a number of challenges in their communities. What do you see as some of the greatest challenges to well-being and future success? Our community partners were especially interested in asking young Black men and other key stakeholders to share their stories or narratives about the police. So for young Black men, we plan to ask, when you think about your experiences with police, do you have a story that helps to explain how you feel about them? And our partners were interested in understanding the extent to which others perceived historical, intergenerational, and institutional violence. What are some of the reasons that you think young Black men and their families and their communities can feel uncomfortable with police? We have the words here, uncomfortable, but really we're going to use the stories that people tell us to inform the language that we use when we ask our questions. So it might be, why do you think that young Black men, their families, and their communities can feel angry with police or afraid of police? So some attendees might have actually shared some time with me in a class where we talked about organizational change. We've actually used some theories of change to inform this next set of questions. We want to give young Black men a chance to tell us what they think should be changed. And This is a way of thinking about how can we sense unsatisfied demands on the system when we think about systems of policing and criminal justice. When you think about the way that police officers interact with young Black men and other members of their community, what do you think should be changed? And then searching through possible responses and really using the social ecological model, which I'll show you and we'll talk about later, to inform the way that we shape our questions. Let's think through some ways that violence between police officers and young Black men could be prevented. So first we'll begin with interpersonal strategies, our close relationships. What things could police officers and young Black men do together to strengthen their relationships and understanding of one another? We also want to have a focus on police department policies and practices. Are there practices, or in other words, ways of interacting that police officers can do to reduce the likelihood that interactions with young Black men, and I actually have a window on top of this that's making it hard for me to read the remainder of my question, but can reduce the likelihood that interactions with young Black men and others will not become violent or hostile. Community strategies are something that we want to explore. What could be done to help communities organize and work together to prevent officer-involved shootings of young Black men and other interactions between police officers and young Black men that have the potential for violence? We wanted to highlight that we know that there is much community work that's being done at present. We want to gain an understanding of our key stakeholders' understanding of that work, how they think that work is going, how it could potentially be improved. And we want to anticipate challenges and generate possible solutions. What challenges might communities and police face in working together to prevent violence involving police and young Black men? How do you think those challenges could be overcome? So how will we apply the information that we've learned across these two pilot projects, one that's completed and one that we're planning and that we're planning to implement this summer? So again, thinking at different levels of social ecology, how can we refine strategies for building interpersonal relationships? The Minneapolis Health Department Office of Violence Prevention has been planning programs for police and youth. COVID-19 actually interrupted a program that they planned to implement in person. That's been put on hold. But they had been planning to have young Black men and police officers come together to talk, to have a shared experience in terms of watching a documentary about slavery and talking about how the legacy persists today and what does that look like and what does that mean in terms of how police can interact with communities. Planning to read Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me and have a conversation about that, what it's like to raise a young Black man, the fear that you have if they interact with police. So to me, this was a really, meaningful planning taking place and hopefully something that can still occur. Organizational change within police departments. Just some examples, policies that govern hiring and review. Who are we entrusting with this important role of interacting with our communities? Ongoing training, implicit bias, de-escalation, empathy for others, relationship building. How can we change norms that influence practices? And something I've been thinking a lot about is how those norms are not only within the police department itself, but also the police union. Policies that govern practices and consequences for misconduct. We're seeing a lot of talk about that, and we want to see more action. Community capacity building and mobilization. How can we coordinate and leverage existing resources? How can we expand our capacity and mobilization based on community feedback? And how do we develop policies, implement policies to address structural racism in different domains? Education, housing. Rhonda and I also wanted to acknowledge that there has been a lot of thought and work into the types of policies that we've been addressing, particularly when we think of policing. So we wanted to direct others' attention to Campaign Zero and their recommendations. These recommendations have been informed by community input, research, and also President Barack Obama's 21st Century Policing Report, something that was set aside with the new administration, but something our communities and our police departments really need to embrace. Ending broken windows policing, having community oversight, limit the use of force, to have independent investigations and prosecutions, to have community representation within the police force and any kind of committee or board. Body cams, filming the police, training, ending for-profit policing, demilitarization, something we can all speak to in our own Minneapolis communities, and having fair police union contracts where there are standards, there are norms and expectations, and it's not just no matter what happens, you stand up and defend it, because you cannot defend the indefensible. My computer is thinking, but I am attempting to advance to the next slide. This is, I think what happened is my computer thought that I wanted to take us to the Campaign Zero website. You may not be able to see this. I'm going to try and get back to the slides.
We can see the different levels, Sonya.
Oh, you can?
Yeah.
I just
Society,
can't see them.
Yeah.
Okay, so I can imagine this, and if you're seeing the social ecological model, that is great. That is what we want to show. So we are embedded within a social ecology. When we think of ourselves, when we think of young Black men, when we think of any community members, we have our close interpersonal relationships. We're embedded within institutions such as the School of Public Health. Others are embedded within the Minneapolis Police Department. We're embedded within churches, places of worship. We're embedded within communities that we can define by shared social identity. And we are embedded within our larger society, and we can think of policies and ways of reforming. And so what we wanted to do was to really open up this seminar now to a conversation. And the first question that we wanted to ask, and this is something that we also know that others are discussing within various forums, is what can we do as a School of Public Health, and what can we do as public health professionals to prevent violence between police and by police against communities of color and young Black men in particular. We can think of programs, we can think of practices, we can think of policies. So we invite your ideas now.
I am Carmen Wilcox, and I would like to talk, but I don't know. So, was someone going to talk?
Yeah, no. Hi, this is Jennifer. I've gotten some questions in the chat, and they're all for the panelists to this point about your research, Rhonda and Sonya. So if anyone would like to send me a question in the chat function, this is Jennifer Lindy. I will go ahead and pass those on. And I mean, maybe it makes sense for us to start with the work that Rhonda and Sonya have just presented, and then we can move on to the broader discussion if that works for everybody.
Sure.
Hi, Jennifer, this is Jamie. That works for me. Just, sorry, I had the internet quit working.
Yeah, no, we all love when that happens. Welcome back.
Yeah. So we'll spend, I want to make sure that we have enough time for our full panelist discussion. So we'll take maybe, we'll probably spend the next 10, 15 minutes with questions that are specific towards Dr. Jones-Webb's and Dr. Brady's presentation. And then we will sort of open it up to, we'll come back with a bigger, larger panel.
Fantastic, thank you. So I will go ahead and start. I'm going to go through these in order. As I said, all of the questions so far relate to the presentation. So the first question was, what types of examples of institutional racism did stakeholders highlight in law enforcement?
It primarily, in terms of employment practices, so the lack of diversity on the police force, how police are trained as kind of warriors rather than as servants. Those are two examples that come to mind.
Fantastic, thank you. This question came up. Okay, there were some related questions, and I'm going to merge them. So this is kind of a two-parter. First, how are the data going to be analyzed and shared with communities? And there was a real emphasis on that piece. And then again, this is related, plans and strategies for sharing results with the communities who were engaged in supporting their follow-up ideas and action steps.
Okay, I can speak to that. One of the emphasis in CHAMPS is really around community partnerships, and we tried to take that to heart. And so we, prior to implementing the grant, we really did try to think about other ways of communicating findings. So one, participants were asked if they wanted to get access to the findings after the study. And then second, we used really kind of community radio, KMOJ, and shared some of the key findings in a radio spot on that particular show. So those are kind of two immediate efforts that really come to mind. And then I'm sorry, the second question?
Sorry. Yeah, no, this was, yeah, so it's basically about, yeah, sharing the results with communities and then getting their feedback on next steps, but then also how are these data being analyzed? So sorry,
okay.
Questions at the same time, I apologize.
Right, right.
I did want to add that for our second pilot project, one of the great things about partnering with the Office of Violence Prevention and their community navigators is that they have a lot of ideas about how we can share our findings and the best forums and how to have the greatest outreach. And that one of the plans for how we would apply our findings is what can we best do to mobilize communities, and that might be leveraging existing resources, approaching existing organizations, trying to combine efforts. Again, the Office of Violence Prevention is a really great community partner towards those efforts as well. And these are qualitative data collection efforts, so we identify themes and sub-themes. We've not collected any quantitative data as part of either of these projects. Rhonda, did you want to add something?
Oh, no, that's fine. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you both. Another question was whether the governor and or the mayor are aware of this work that you're doing.
Probably not, unless they I don't know, they may have staff. Again, I mentioned earlier, we have 2 articles that have been published, one very recently, I think it was January of this year. So I can't say completely they're not aware. Again, we've published 2 articles from our work. Yeah, but I've not had an opportunity to have personal conversations with them or their staff about our work. I think it probably reflects definitely a gap in an area where we could definitely do better.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we have a couple more questions specifically for you, and then we'll shift to
Okay.
I just saw a suggestion, since this is related to what we were just talking about. If your work is published in media outlets or other formats where the community can not only access it, but be able to offer their perspective. So, you know, thinking beyond traditional
Sure.
academic channels. So that was a suggestion from our community here. So, okay, so I want to make sure we're staying on time with this, but the next question is, with the city starting to talk, the city council has been talking pretty publicly lately in the last few days about radically changing the police force and talking about sort of abolishing policing as we know it now.
Mm-hmm.
So given that, how do you see your work fitting into this model?
I think I say it's just part of the broader debate around the role of law enforcement. And so it's one perspective in terms of, you know, thinking about changes that really need to occur within police departments. But again, I see it as just part of this larger debate in terms of law enforcement. Where should we be committing our resources? Would they better be used in serving communities rather than in law enforcement?
I also wanted to speak to this. I have learned so much from the community navigators that we've been working with as part of our second pilot project. And one of the things I think a lot about is the types of contexts in which young people interact with police officers. And so our community navigators described a police officer from the Minneapolis Police Department who's a school resource officer, and the strong relationship that young Black men have with this particular police officer. And so when I hear conversations about let's get rid of the Minneapolis Police Department within our institutions, I have mixed feelings because I understand where that's coming from, and I understand the fear of having police officers who are not prepared to interact in positive ways with the community and wanting to protect community members from that. But then I think of the police officers mentioned by the navigators who have such a strong positive relationship. And if there's not that opportunity, you know, so I think, could there be a model where there's a lot of vetting and there's a lot of choice that institutions have and who they invite into their communities? So there would still be an opportunity to interact with police officers in positive ways that have nothing to do about policing, but it's someone who's present to be a resource, you know, and an ally and a source of support.
So I think Dr. Brady raises a really good question here, in that when we're talking about doing a radical reorganization of policing, we need to think about what that looks like using a perspective of anti-racism, right? So anti-racism incorporates empathy. It incorporates listening to the voices and suggestions and ideas of those who are marginalized. And it's going to also require us to use anti-racist language, behavior, and policies. And so, in essence, it's redefining what policing is, right? And that's what we're I think the beauty of the work that you all have presented just really supports this need for the redefining of policing, and that new definition is going to have to be grounded in the roots of anti-racism, and that And if you ground something in anti-racism, it requires empathy. It requires inclusion. It requires diversity. And it establishes a new social contract between all of us in this community that we live together in.
I have a really great follow-up comment about this from one of our attendees, that there can be opportunities to have relationship with other resource people in schools who are not police, if we're thinking about how we expand the model of who is present in our community to provide that support. And we can think creatively about using funds for police resource officers to employ community members in roles that support young people who may be better equipped to serve in supporting those people who are better equipped to build those supportive relationships, not just with the youth, but also with their families.
Thank you, Jennifer. So we're going to take one last question from Clement Wilcox, because she had requested to speak, and then we will transition to the other portion of our webinar.
Yeah, thanks for your patience, Clement. What's your question?
Well, it was a comment, and I don't know if it has much of a question, so maybe it belongs to the other part of the meeting. I don't know. I can say what I was going to say, but I don't know.
I think that'd be great.
Well, this is an issue that is very important for me, being a Black Latino woman, an immigrant, which has a lot of minorities. So I have to have in mind all those kinds of different influences in my personality. But I love this study, and one of the things that I would propose about this is, since I began to work for the university, which is very recently, less than a year, I feel, and the community tells me this in my own work, that the university is so far away from the community issues. And I'm afraid that we need to be uncomfortable in our own skin here at the university and try to model the way for others and begin to breathe these things, because it's very hard to go and tell a community to change when they can see that we here at the university still have a lot of issues with racism. A lot of people think oh, this study is wonderful, this is happening outside in the community, all these things the community doesn't understand, or they need to converse, or they need to do this. But what about us? What about us? When are we going to begin to talk about these issues internally? When are we going to? I think it's wonderful that we are beginning right now, but I really want us to feel uncomfortable about this, because the more uncomfortable we are about this, the more we are going to improve. If you are behind this camera feeling like, I don't want to talk about this, this is not me, then it's you, because we need to talk about that. So I'm sorry that I made the comment in the wrong part of the thing, but I'm very passionate about this, and I'm very passionate about change, and the fact that we have 237 people attending today, that means that we all care. But do we care enough to talk deeply about these issues inside before we go with them trying to change the world outside?
Absolutely. No, I think that was a very beautiful and very appropriate comment for us to sort of end that segment of the webinar and transition. And, you know, I think one of the things that you mentioned is intersectionality, right? In terms of how you see the world and how you feel the world, and how you interact with the world, right? And intersectionality is a very important thing. And embracing it allows us to better embrace the ideas of inclusion and diversity, and to be open to an anti-racism way of thinking. The other thing that I want to reiterate and you know, just sort of raise my hand to is the fact that you said we need to be uncomfortable. And today is only the beginning of becoming uncomfortable. We're going to have to be uncomfortable for a very long time, because tearing down structural racism, tearing down systemic racism is a very difficult thing, and we have to remain vigilant in that process. And this, for those of us who are, you know, we may be uncomfortable, like you said, we have to go through this process so that we all can breathe, right? We don't want to hear anybody else saying that they can't breathe when they're an interaction with the police occur, or an interaction with any system or institution in our society. And I think your comment really finally gets back to the question of the university as a white-centered organization, right? So as a predominantly white institution, what is it going to do to make the necessary changes that reflect the values of anti-racism, that support the community inside of its walls, but also around its walls, right? And those are answering that is going to require some discomfort and some out-of-the-box thinking. And so what I'm going to do is introduce the rest of our panelists. So for the rest of our discussion, we are going to be not only joined by Dr. Jones-Webb and Dr. Brady, but we're going to also be joined by Tricia Alexander, who is a first-year MPH, Public Health and Nutrition MPH student, and aspires to be a registered dietitian working with women and children of color, with emphasis on the Black community. And she has prior experience during her undergraduate studies of community engagement. And then we'll also be joined by Phyllis Thomas, who is on staff here in the Division of Epidemiology and Community Health. And Phyllis describes herself as, Miss Thomas describes herself as a person that is passionate about community service and well-being of underserved communities, and often volunteers for different organizations through the Twin Cities. And she is a mentor to many young women of color. And so as I'm going to ask our two new panelists to maybe say, you know, to introduce or say a couple of quick thoughts that they have. But I want to remind everybody that during this discussion, we need to make sure that we remain respectful in our discussion, that we allow for people to make mistakes, that we use call-ins and not call-outs, because we want to maintain the learning environment, and call-outs interfere with establishing a safe or maintaining a safe environment for us to learn. So we'll start with Tricia.
Hello, everyone. Excuse me. My name is Tricia Alexander. Like Jaime mentioned, I'm a MPH student studying nutrition. Just want to center myself as well in this space. I am a Minnesota native. Grew up in Eden Prairie, Minnesota since I was 7 years old. Went to Colorado State University for my undergrad. So I did leave Minnesota for 4 years, but I'm back now. So I have not personally dwelled within the Twin Cities area, but I have had a lot of connections with folks who do live in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area as I've grown up in Eden Prairie. I'm also a first-generation American. My parents are from Kenya, immigrated to this country for college and had me here. So I do also have this duality of experiencing my mother's immigrant experience while also navigating what it means to be an African American without necessarily having my mom have that experience growing up. So there's a lot of duality in my home, a lot of exploration of what Blackness means. I bring that up to say that going through the public education system, I have learned a lot about American history from a white narrative, and I had to take the time to learn about my history myself in my own time. I had to find those sources. I had to go through the readings from W.E. Du Bois, from Audre Lorde, from all these folks who were not present in my reading material growing up. So just wanted to center myself in this space, kind of share a little bit more of who I am with you all before we dive into the conversation further.
Great. So thank you for sharing, Tricia, and reminding and centering yourself, sharing yourself, a piece of yourself with us today. Next, we'll have Phyllis.
Hello, everybody. My name is Phyllis Thomas, and I work as an ARIC study coordinator. I've been with the U for over 20 years. Just would like to say I'm tired. Mentoring young ladies and young boys as well. You teach them, and I was taught that if you better, go education, get educated, do the right thing. If you, follow a straight and narrow path, that things will be all right. And when I mentor these kids to tell them that's what you need to do, and that's not enough, it's disheartening. So my point to this is a heart issue. And if you haven't felt it in your heart, that's a problem. If you haven't seen people's faces and seen or sensed the distress, it's a problem. If you haven't reached out to any people that you may know that may have been affected one way or another by this, it's a problem. And at some point in time, we need to get real with ourselves and notice we may be the problem. And what are we going to do? And I would encourage you to be intentional about what you're going to do and follow through and be consistent, because the world needs that. And we are looking for that. And I would expect that within the university, we are leaders. We're here for a purpose. Use that. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis. I think your first statement is something that resonates with many belonging to the Black community, as well as other communities of color, we are tired, right? And so I'm going to ask my 4 panelists to sort of comment on a question that I raised on my Twitter account. And that is, as well as the audience can comment on this too, is George Floyd what do we do to make George Floyd the last martyr of police violence? Is George Floyd our Emmett Till of today, right? In which the brutality, what both of those have in common, Emmett Till and George Floyd, is the display of brutality that one cannot turn their eyes from, right? So in the civil rights movement, Emmett Till, his mother had pictures taken and an open casket that allowed people to see the brutality of his lynching. George Floyd, we saw on video 8 minutes and 46 seconds in which he could not breathe. How do we make George Floyd or how do we take this moment and make change? How do we not go back to normal? Because normal isn't good enough.
I feel like it begins with what Phyllis said. You have to soul search. And I don't mean to call people out, I'm calling you in. This is what my family, we call it tough love, right? So I'm asking you, non-Black folks, what are you doing in your life to quote unquote clean house, right? So I have had to go through the process of changing my consciousness because we've all been colonized by oppression. So I have had to go through my own process of fighting with family, of losing friendships, because these were people I realized are not for me. They're not fighting for my liberation. And I pretty much had to tear myself apart and realize, where are these nooks and crannies where white supremacy is really lying within me, right? So I really ask others to do the same, because if you don't do that same soul searching and self-work, your good intentions are going to bring harm, just more harm. Because I feel as if there's no way you can, let's say, come to the university and be for equity and justice and liberation, yet you have people around you who are not speaking up. Maybe they're silent. Maybe they're saying things when it's only you all around. There's no Black people around. Like, what are you doing to disrupt all the spaces you're in? Because another reason I am personally struggling with folks who have come forward to me during this time is I realize this really George Floyd might be a true awakening for some people. I get that. And how do I know if you're being performative or if you're being productive? How do I know? Because, sorry, my voice keeps breaking, but because I personally have been let down by a lot of non-Black folks who there's empty promises, whether they're in my personal life, in the institutions I attend. There's this momentum that builds, right? And then, like Jaime said, we go back to normal. But normal isn't good enough. So I need to know are you truly dedicated to this work, or is it a white savior complex? Like, let's be real, right? Are you doing this to show others, oh, I'm not with the racists, I'm not there, I'm different? Are you doing it to make yourself feel better? Because if that's what it is, then to be honest, I don't want you to join this fight, because like I said, you're going to hurt more people than help. So this is my tough love to everybody, to really look at yourself in the mirror and dig deep and find what is your why for joining this work. Why haven't you joined this work before? And I don't mean that to deter you from being part of change, but just, you really need to clean house and see, why did it take for George Floyd for you to now see we need to change things? Because folks have been talking about this for centuries. So yeah, I just really wanted to touch on that piece of, you have to work within before you can work without.
Thank you, Trisha. I think you really set that stage, that people need to have a conversation with themselves about where are they situated on the continuum of cultural humility, in which practicing anti-racism means that you are ever moving towards that cultural humility, right? Instead of destruction, right? Or staying silent. And after we have that conversation with ourselves, right? Where do we begin? So that requires us to take on some anti-racism education after we say that we're committed. So I was wondering if readers could maybe suggest some, what were some of the readings that they used, that you used to educate yourself in the ways of anti-racism?
Can I say something before we go there? And this is Clement again. Sorry, Clement Wilcox. I would like to say something related to that self-reflection that we all are proposed to have, including people of color, because we do need to self-reflect. We all have our own things inside. But I just want to invite everyone to think about the situation that for us, people of color, the ones that are suffering day to day, they will suffer after this webinar. They have been suffering before this webinar, that our families are suffering, that our sisters, brothers, parents, everyone has suffering. In order for us to get more, people who benefit from this needs to give up. It doesn't matter how much you want to change the situation if you don't want to give up the benefits you reap after our pain. And I have said it this week more than once, if you are ahead of me because of your skin color, you need to give up that in order for me to gain it. So I have to give up things because I'm a privileged Latina too. So I have to give up things. So in that self-reflection, we all need to think how much we have to give up in order for someone to gain. And I wish I could say that you don't need to give up some of your things for us to gain them, but it's the world. The only way things are going to be balanced is if people who benefit from racism can give up some of what they get. At least some. I'm not asking for everything, but at least begin to give up some.
So, I think that, Clement, you make a really, really good point. And again, you're bringing in that intersectionality and knowing where your social location is within all of the different social identities that we sit in, and knowing what privilege is attached to them. In your comment, one of the ways that I interpret your comment is that the sum of the parts wait, help me with that saying, you guys. The sum of the parts is greater than the whole. And I think that's very true, that in each of us understanding where our privilege sits, on giving up or utilizing our privilege in order to bring others forth, we actually create a stronger community and a more just society. So sort of linking that to my question, what are some of the resources or materials, educational materials that you all use to help you go through the process of decolonization of your mind, right? And a retraining in anti-racism? Is there any?
This is Lisa Harnick.
Sure.
I'll turn on my camera too so you can see me if I can figure that out. I really appreciate the call in. I've been thinking hard about, and I think probably many of us have, like, what we've been doing is not enough or not right. It's not good, not the right strategy, rethinking the strategy. And I've been looking and reading on white allyship, where maybe first we need to educate ourselves and make sure we know how to be good partners so we're more productive, not destructive. I mean, we could be doing the wrong things. And I'm wondering what the panelists think about that model of proceeding for those of us who are thinking about what to do better and differently.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Lisa. I think I even hesitate with allyship. Not that I'm saying it's the wrong word. I think some folks have co-opted that word in a way that's not productive. But I also have seen resources out there that are very productive for white allyship. So I just wanted to name that first. But for me, a big thing is narrative. So I'm wearing a shirt right now, you can't see it, but it says Black history didn't begin with slavery, right? So being a first generation American, I struggled coming to school and realizing, why are we starting with slavery when I personally have family in Africa where, like, that's not how our story started. So I bring that up to say, whenever we do anything in this work, really centering the voices of, at this moment, Black people, because, because I struggle when white allyship appears as, I want to give you a voice. I want to give you a platform, when no, like we've had a voice. There is power within us. We're not from there's a lot of resilience in Black folks. I don't like this idea of the voiceless, this deficit lens. I really think that there needs to be a paradigm shift in which we all see value in what Black folks have to give and in the way they have to give it, right? So in an institution of higher education, I've been taught, standards of 5-paragraph essays, qualitative research. And I look at folks like Jamila Lyscott. I would definitely recommend Jamila Lyscott if you have not seen any of her TED Talks. She is a professor at the University of Massachusetts, and she teaches other professors how to educate communities of color. And she talks about how you need to disrupt the spaces you teach in, right? She, for example, doesn't teach in a lecture style. She teaches in a circle because she believes that education needs to be shared. You need to be learning from your students as much as they're learning from you. And she also uses what we in the Black community call a cipher, which is a circle where you freestyle rap. So she said she wants to shift the narrative of language. So when she teaches students who are predominantly Black and they want to share their knowledge in the style of a rap, she embraces that. She doesn't go, you know what, that's not up to standard. You can't do that. She embraces what value that brings to the realm of education. Because it interrupts the status quo, right? It changes how we frame what education means, what sophistication means, what professionalism means. So for me, one thing I would love to see, especially from my faculty, is exploring that, disrupting your spaces, right? I'm not against qualitative research. I think there can be duality, right? But how I present my research, give me some room in that. If I want to do it in a spoken word, let me do it. If I want to do it in a dance, let me do it, because I personally have felt like to be granted access into these institutions, I have had to compromise parts of myself. Code switching, we talk about it all the time, right? I code switch all the time in these institutions because I feel like that's the way I survive here. That's the way I get my degree. But that's something that I really think of when I think of white allyship, specifically in institutions, is disrupt your teaching space. And the person that I think of, like I mentioned, is Jamila Scott. And I would love to see faculty and staff do one of her training sessions. She provides those sessions at a cost, right? Because no free labor. Okay, people of color are done with free labor. You need to value our voices. You need to value our emotional and intellectual work just as much as we value yours. So I just really wanted to put her out there, and I hope to see some work happen with that suggestion.
Thank you, Trisha. I think you definitely raised some really good points about how the language we are taught to express ourselves in, that we are taught to conduct science in, and putting this into a public health lens, that the lens in which we are taught to conduct public health in all its various forms and approaches, is from a more dominant lens, and we need to be open and flexible to incorporate narratives that lift up the more diverse and cultures and communities, right? So I know we are we're limited on time. We're approaching 3 minutes, and we did start off a little bit with some technical difficulties. But I want to just say that this is just the first of many seminar series that we are going to have. And I actually hate the fact that we're calling them, that these are seminar series, right? It's really, this is the first of community call-ins. I think I'm gonna say it that way, that we're having. Many of the questions, for those of you who submitted questions, do not walk away thinking that your question is going to evaporate into thin air. We are actually documenting everybody's questions, and we're going to organize their questions and comments in categories in which we can organize future community call-ins and action strategizing sessions where we can come together at later dates. I have been sort of putting together a list of educational resources for those who would like to better educate themselves in the process of anti-racism. We will hopefully, I'll be sending those out at a later date as I finish sort of curating the list, as well as combining some other lists that have already been created. So what I want to do is just sort of close out and just say I thank you to everyone who has attended, and I just want to give the panelists an opportunity to have the final words.
I'd like to defer to Tricia and Phyllis, who didn't have as much opportunity to share their thoughts. So I'll defer to them. Nope.
Yeah, I just would like to agree with what Jaime has to say. If this is not the end, I don't want to see this be the end of the conversation. I want to give a little shout out to some PHAP students who put together a letter that was sent Finnegan, and it's just the beginning of some student demands of what we would like to see, some calls to action. So if you haven't seen that letter, it would be great if you could get in touch with some folks to see that letter. There's a lot of student voices that have contributed to that letter and continue to contribute. It's still a growing movement, if you will. And I just wanted to highlight that and highlight other groups like a Black Graduate and Professional Student Alliance. There are a lot of student groups who are having these conversations and doing this work. And I would love to see faculty and staff get involved in that as well. And I mention these things because I hope this isn't, folks aren't going to stop and go, well, I'll just wait until the next call in, the next time we do this virtual meetup. I hope this is something that propels you to search these things out, because there are folks within our School of Public Health community, students especially, who are mobilizing and are really looking for those within the community, especially faculty and staff, that can support them in their mobilizing. So I just wanted to drop some of those.
Yes, it was.
Thank you, Tricia.
Yeah, it's a movement. I feel a movement. I sense a movement. I sense a change. And if anything, this has given organizations, like say I belong to the Black Faculty and Staff Association, there's a movement. And I would encourage those who would like to be on board to be on board. But again, you have to start with yourself and your heart and really know that it's not going to be easy, but we're willing to do it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Phyllis, you couldn't have said it any better. It starts with each of us doing our own work and knowing that the term racist is not a noun, it is an adjective, and can describe our behaviors, our language, our assumptions, and our actions. And we need to be conscious of when that adjective is rising in our thoughts, language, behavior, policies, and institutions. Rhonda, do you have like a closing thought, or Sonya, do you have a closing thought that you wanted to say?
I think for me, it's I just want to, for me personally, this is something where there's just greater resolve to be part of social change, and I hope others would see that this opportunity the same.
I wanted to speak to something Tricia said earlier about seeing momentum gain or feeling that it gained only to see it subside and to have that be so disappointing. Governor Tim Walz said the other day, pick something, and what he was speaking to was this sense that it's an overwhelming task, that there are so many things that need to be changed in so many domains to address structural racism, and his call was to pick something that you care passionately about and to sustain that effort. And I think that's a way to stay involved and engaged and not just wait for the next call-in, which is really important to have these call-ins, but to continue working in between.
No, absolutely. Just making sure that you pick something, right? And staying committed to it, because no one can do, it doesn't matter how many community call-ins that we have, that is not going to be enough space for each of us to, for all the work to be done. There's going to be a lot of work that's going to have to happen in between each of our community call-ins. And for those of you who during this conversation are sort of leaving with a feeling of ambiguity, right? In terms of, is my presence wanted in this movement or not? And what I would say is that your presence is wanted if you are committed to doing the work so that action can be, can take place, right? To create change. And I think that's really what the bottom line is. It's committing to do the work and using your voice and your privilege to create a space and place that upholds equity.
So I just want to, I'm gonna need to call the time now because we actually have a faculty meeting where we're gonna be continuing this conversation.
Sorry, Diane, I don't mean to interrupt you, but we got a really important point from an attendee that I would like to make before we close. And it's that we have not yet acknowledged that we are on ancestral homelands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe indigenous people, and they have a longstanding history and connection to the land as the original stewards of the ground on which we sit, stand, live, and that many American Indians have also been forcibly exiled from their lands because of aggressive and persistent colonialism and government policy. And that this is not something that we brought up yet, and it's very important to bring up and something we should think about, you know, incorporating as we move forward.
Thank you. So I just want to, you can all turn off your mutes now, and let's give a round of applause to our panelists and our moderator.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So powerful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone for coming and participating.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Keep it up.
Thank you. Thank you. I look forward to the next opportunities and learning opportunities and resources.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.